All right, let's jump into another deep dive. And today we're going to be tackling something pretty big.
Okay.
We're talking about science and politics.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, how some executive orders from the Trump administration are causing some people to worry in the scientific community.
Yeah, for sure.
And we're looking at a Times higher education article called Trump's Executive Orders Wreak Havoc on Science.
Right. I think what's interesting is these orders aren't just these like general policy changes, right? It's like
Yeah.
they have a very specific and immediate impact on researchers and the projects that they're working on.
So let's get into it then.
Yeah.
One of the biggest things the article talks about is this freeze on federal research grants.
Yeah.
We're talking about billions of dollars that are basically being withheld from major institutions
So
like the NIH and the NSF.
And the Department of Energy.
Yeah. What does that actually mean, though, for science? What does that look like?
I mean, think about the NIH, right? Like they fund something like 25% of all U.S. health research. So that's like everything from basic scientific discoveries to clinical trials, testing out new treatments and stuff.
Right.
This freeze basically just throws this huge wrench in the entire system,
Yeah.
Projects are getting put on hold, different groups working together are being disrupted, and there's just this like real fear that we could lose years of progress because of it.
And the article actually mentions this story about a biologist at Purdue who was supposed to give this lecture, but it got canceled.
Oh, wow.
Because the speaker they had lined up from the NIH couldn't travel because of the ban.
Right.
Is that kind of a common thing that's happening?
Yeah, I mean, that story is just like one tiny example of just how disruptive this is being.
Yeah.
One area that's been hit really hard is research into new cancer treatments.
Oh, wow.
For example, like there's this team at Johns Hopkins that was working on this new approach to immunotherapy for lung cancer.
Yeah.
And they had to completely stop their clinical trials because they just didn't know if they were going to have the money to keep going.
Oh, wow.
I mean, that could set the research back years, And that could potentially impact like patients who are literally waiting for these new treatments.
Yeah, that really shows just how much is at stake here.
Yeah, absolutely.
But is there another side to this at all? I know the article focuses on the scientific community's perspective, but is there anyone who sees this freeze as a good thing?
Well, some people argue that taking a break like this could be a chance to reassess priorities.
Okay.
And make sure that taxpayer money is being used in the best way possible.
Yeah.
Like they might point to situations where, maybe money was wasted or research projects that just didn't produce any really useful results.
Yeah, right.
But even the people who agree with the freeze, generally they admit that the way it was done, like with no warning and no clear guidelines, it's just created a lot of chaos.
It sounds like even if there was a good reason behind it, the way it was done was just kind of a mess.
Yeah, pretty much.
Let's move on to a different executive order now.
Oh.
This one is targeting what some people are calling woke gender ideology and diversity initiatives.
Right.
And also some foreign aid programs.
Yeah.
And this is where things start to get a little complicated because the order doesn't really define woke gender ideology very clearly.
Exactly. And that's what's got a lot of researchers worried. It's like this chilling effect on anything that has to do with gender or sexuality or social justice because they just don't know where the lines are.
Can you give us some examples of what kind of research might be affected by this?
Sure. So imagine research that's looking into how effective different sex education programs are, or studies that are examining how gender-affirming care impacts transgender youth. Those are just two examples. But there are so many areas that could fall under that really broad category of woke gender ideology. And now they're all facing these potential funding challenges.
Yeah.
And the big concern is that these decisions about funding are going to be based on political motivations rather than on the scientific value of the research itself.
It definitely makes you wonder what's going to happen to research in these areas, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if we're going to lose valuable knowledge and insights because funding is being cut off.
Exactly. That's the big worry. It's
Yeah.
like, are we going to miss out on important discoveries because of this?
Definitely something to think about.
For sure.
It's not just the funding for research that they're going after, right?
Right.
The article also talks about this order to basically get rid of diversity offices across all these government agencies.
Yeah.
So how does that connect to science at all?
Well, I mean, these offices do a lot to promote inclusivity and try to deal with disparities in like STEM fields, They often lead initiatives to try and get more women and minorities into science and engineering, which ultimately benefits everyone, right?
Yeah.
Because you get more diverse perspectives and more talent involved.
So by getting rid of these offices, are we like taking a step backwards when it comes to diversity in science?
I think that's a real concern, yeah. Less diversity means fewer voices are being heard, right? Which could lead to, like, a much smaller range of research questions being asked.
Yeah.
And that could limit what we can discover, potentially.
Right.
Plus, it risks making the existing inequalities in STEM fields even worse, which have always been dominated by, white males.
Yeah.
So it's a problem.
And this kind of leads into another issue the article mentions, which is the potential brain drain caused by changes in immigration policies.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Can you talk about that a bit more?
Sure. So the U.S. has always been this, huge draw for scientists and researchers from all over the world, right?
Right.
But if it gets harder to get a visa and the whole immigration climate becomes less welcoming, it's going to be a lot harder for foreign scientists to even come to the U.S. or to stay here long term.
Yeah.
Which means we could lose a lot of talent and expertise.
Right.
And that could really hurt the country's ability to stay competitive in science.
It seems like kind of the opposite of what they're trying to do.
Oh,
right?
exactly.
Like they want to keep America at the forefront of science and tech.
Yeah.
But these policies could actually be pushing away the people who help us do that.
Yeah, I mean, science is a global effort, right?
Right.
And we make progress by working together with people from all over the world and by sharing ideas.
Right.
When you start restricting the movement of scientists, it just slows everything down, and it could end up isolating the U.S. scientific community.
So we've got grant freezes, restrictions on certain research topics, the dismantling of diversity offices, and potential immigration barriers.
It's a lot.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of challenges for the scientific community.
It is, and there's definitely a sense of uncertainty and worry.
Yeah.
Nobody really knows how these executive orders are going to play out in the long run
Right.
or what the full impact will be. But
Yeah.
there's a real possibility of serious disruption and a chilling effect on scientific research.
The article also mentions this potential appointment of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be the head of the Department of Health and Human Services. And Kennedy, of course, is known for his skepticism towards vaccines.
Yeah.
So how could that appointment, if it happens, how could that affect scientific research, especially within the NIH?
Well, the NIH plays a huge role in funding and setting the priorities for medical research in the U.S., right?
Yeah.
So if you have someone running the agency who has views that go against the scientific consensus on things like vaccines, well,
Yeah.
that could have a huge impact on what kind of research actually gets funded and
yeah.
what kind of public health policies get promoted.
So basically, we could see a shift away from things like vaccine development and towards research that supports Kennedy's views, even if those views don't line up with what most scientists think.
That's exactly the concern that a lot of scientists and public health experts have.
Yeah.
They're worried that political ideology is going to override scientific evidence when decisions are being made at the NIH.
Right.
And that could have some really far-reaching consequences for public health and for scientific progress in things like infectious disease research.
It sounds like it's definitely something we need to keep an eye on.
Definitely.
We've covered a lot here, and it's clear these executive orders are having a big impact across the entire scientific landscape.
Yeah.
But beyond all the immediate disruptions and concerns, what do you think the long-term consequences might be? Kind of feels like the whole foundation of science is being questioned here.
Yeah, I think what really worries me is that people might start to lose trust in science as a whole.
Right.
I mean, when it looks like decisions about funding and research priorities are based more on politics than on actual science, it just makes people think that science isn't objective or reliable anymore.
Yeah.
And that could have huge long-term consequences for how we deal with things like climate change, or public health crises, or even just technological advances.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. It's not like this is the first time science and politics have clashed, right?
Right.
But it feels different this time somehow.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, it feels a lot more intense.
I think it's probably a combination of things,
Yeah. Like the way social media spreads misinformation and how divided our political discourse has become. And there's just this general distrust of institutions these days. And science, which used to be seen as this source of objective truth, is getting caught in the crossfire.
The article quotes a physicist who says, "Science thrives on open inquiry, the free exchange of ideas, and a respect for evidence-based conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
When those principles are undermined, the entire scientific enterprise suffers.
Yeah, that's a really powerful statement.
Yeah.
And it really gets at what's at stake here. We're not just talking about some abstract debate, right? Scientific research has a real impact on people's lives.
Yeah.
I mean, it's responsible for things like life-saving medicines and the technologies we use every day. So when politics starts interfering with the pursuit of knowledge, it's ultimately the public that suffers.
So for our listener out there, who's maybe feeling overwhelmed by all of this,
What can they do? How can they stay informed and engaged in these conversations?
well, I think the most important thing is to just stay curious.
Okay.
Look for information from sources you can trust.
Yeah.
Read scientific journals. Engage with experts in different fields.
Yeah,
Don't be afraid to ask questions and challenge what you hear.
right.
And think critically about the information you come across.
Yeah, absolutely. But what about on a more practical level? Are there things people can do to really advocate for science and for making decisions based on evidence?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Support organizations that fight for scientific integrity and funding for research. Reach out to your elected officials and let them know that you care about science and want to see it prioritized.
Yeah.
Talk to your friends and family about the importance of science, literacy, and critical thinking.
Right. Yeah. This has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
It has.
It's clear that the relationship between science and politics is complicated, to say the least.
It is, yeah.
And sometimes it can get pretty heated.
Definitely.
But as we move forward, I think it's really important to remember that science isn't static, right?
Right.
It's constantly changing and evolving.
The process.
Yeah, and it's up to all of us to make sure that process can keep going
Absolutely.
and that it's free from political interference.
Couldn't agree more.
We've given you a lot to think about today, but hopefully it's made you want to learn more and get involved in these really important issues.
That's the goal.
So as always, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of science and the things that shape it.